Hi, we're going to go ahead and open up our notebooks and we're going to work on comparing and contrasting. Go ahead and give your page, your next empty page, a heading. I made mine a little big, so I went down a bit. And go ahead and draw your Venn diagram. And this will be two circles that intersect or cross over each other in the middle. And this gives them some space so that we can write about one character on the left. I will be writing about Mr. Falker, and one character, a different character, on the right. I'll be writing about Mr. Kadinsky. And the things that they have in common that they share will be in this middle section that overlaps. So Mr. Falker is different from Mr. Kadinsky. These are ways he is different. Mr. Kadinsky is different from Mr. Falker. On this side are ways he is different. And in the middle are things that they have in common. So we can think of physical traits like they're both men. We can think of traits like their personalities, their character traits. They're both caring. They both listen to children, or in Mr. Falker's case, one child, but child or children. And Mr. Falker was different from Mr. Kadinsky because Mr. Falker, he was a teacher. That was his job. But do you remember Kadinsky's job? He wasn't a teacher, but he owned a hat shop, and I think he made hats. Okay. Now, we didn't learn a lot about Mr. Falker's life, but we did learn that Mr. Kadinsky, from Miss Eula, she talked about that he had a hard life. You hear my dogs in the background. We also know that Mr. Kadinsky some kids were mean to him. And we know that the children in the story in Chicken Sunday, they didn't think that he smiled a lot, so smiled, oops, I meant to say it differently, not often, right? He didn't smile very often, but they were both caring, they both listened to the children. I know Mr. Kadinsky, he helped the children by letting them sell things in his shop. And Mr. Falker, he helped children by being a teacher and teaching Tricia to read. I'm just going to write reading. I say tutor because he helped her after school, after the teaching. He did extra help. He tutored her. And then Mr. Kadinsky, he helped them he let the kids sell eggs. Okay, so these are my lists. I don't have a lot about Mr. Falker. I don't remember a whole lot about Mr. Falker. He did try to be fair, right? To all the kids. Mr. Kadinsky, when those kids threw the eggs at his door, he was pretty upset. So I don't know. Maybe that's a difference. And I'm going to leave that at that. We know physically one more. We know that Mr. Falker, he was younger, and we know that Mr. Kadinsky, he was older. Okay, so you can list physical differences, physical traits, but we're really concentrating on the character traits, things like the caring and being helpful, being good listeners. Those are character traits. So now you're going to take your ideas for your two characters. You can do this on your own and turn to a new sheet of paper and make your circles, make your Venn diagram big enough to write in. Or you can take, and I still like to do this sideways, but you can take and make a cheat Venn diagram, just a T chart, but it's easier to write everything out. So I could have written about Mr. Falker on this side. He'd have his own column. And then Mr. Kadinsky on the right. And then what they share in common, what both of them have, goes in the middle. And so I could have made that same list from my Venn diagram. If you find drawing the circles is a little tricky, give this a try when you try it on your own. So choose 2 different characters from the Patricia Polacco books we have read. You can look on the page for some ideas. Miss Eula May, Mr. Lincoln, Eugene. So think of 2 different characters, and you're going to do a compare and contrast with them. And then in Canvas, and you can write it down here as well, you will try to 2 sentences. So my 2 sentences, you can see them in the assignment. I'm just going to put C and C for compare and contrast. I'm using my thick marker, which is actually a little too thick for me to put a heading next time. So I'm going to write my 2 sentences, and there is a chart in the assignment that can help you with some sentence frames. And I'm going to write one sentence. Mr. Falker and Mr. Kadinsky both care about children. Something they have in common when I'm comparing them, right? About children. So we were using blue in the worksheet that you see in the lesson to do the comparison. And I'm going to add a contrasting sentence as well. These are the ones that we have in red. We have some red sentence frames there. So I'm going to use this sentence frame, this sentence. A difference between Mr. Falker and Mr. Kadinsky is that Mr. Falker is a teacher and Mr. Kadinsky makes and sells hats. Hats in his shop. Now, if I had chosen 2 different characters like Eugene and Mr. Kadinsky, I would have a lot more differences maybe about their personality traits. I find in thinking about Mr. Falker and Mr. Kadinsky, they probably have more in common as far as character goes than they have different. So my difference sentence is more about what they do. It's not a character trait, but try to think of character trait differences, character trait similarities between the 2 characters you choose. Thank you for working with me, and I'm looking forward to reading your sentences and seeing your assignments.